It all started when I decided to do some much-needed maintenance on my driveway. My property sat on the edge of an HOA-governed neighborhood, but I had always maintained that my land, including my driveway, was private and not subject to their ridiculous rules. The long gravel driveway leading to my house had taken a beating over the years. Rain erosion, constant tire tracks, and natural wear had left it uneven and full of potholes. So I hired a contractor to come in, lay down a new gravel foundation, and repave sections that needed reinforcement. It was a 2-day job, and during that time, I temporarily blocked off the entrance with construction cones and a barricade to prevent damage while the work was being completed. That was apparently all the justification Karen needed to insert herself into my life once again. Karen, the self-appointed ruler of the HOA, had always been a nuisance. She took her title far too seriously, patrolling the neighborhood like some kind of suburban sheriff, issuing fines for minor infractions like unapproved garden decorations or non-compliant mailbox designs. I had largely ignored her over the years since my property wasn't part of the HOA. But Karen, in all her entitlement, refused to acknowledge those boundaries. In her mind, she had the final say over everything within a mile radius of green pines. So when I blocked off my driveway for construction, it was only a matter of time before she showed up. I was inside when I first heard her voice, a shrill, irritated tone barking demands at the workers. I stepped outside to find her standing at the barricade, hands on her hips, glaring at the orange cones as if they were personally offending her. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, pointing at the blocked-off driveway. "You can't just close off access like this. This is a shared roadway." I sighed, already dreading the conversation. "Karen, this is my driveway. It's on my property. I'm having work done, so it's temporarily closed. It's not a public road." She scoffed, shaking her head as if I had just insulted her intelligence. "That's where you're wrong. This driveway connects to our neighborhood. People use this as a shortcut to get to the main road. You can't just shut it down without approval from the HOA." I stared at her, dumbfounded. "Karen, I don't need approval from the HOA. I don't belong to the HOA. This is my land." That's when she really lost it. She puffed up, her face turning red with frustration. "You're disrupting traffic flow. This is unacceptable. You have no right to inconvenience the rest of us like this. I'll be reporting this to the HOA board immediately." I crossed my arms. "Go ahead, but I'll save you some time. Whatever the HOA says doesn't apply to my property." Karen clenched her jaw and stormed off, but I knew this wasn't over. She wasn't the type to let things go, especially when she didn't get her way. A few hours later, I got my second surprise of the day, a police car pulling up to the barricade. 2 officers stepped out, one looking annoyed while the other approached me with a neutral expression. "We got a call about an illegal road closure," one of them said. I sighed, already knowing who was behind it. "Let me guess, Karen?" The officer nodded, clearly used to dealing with this type of nonsense. "She claims you're blocking a public access road." I chuckled dryly. "This is private property. My property. It's my driveway, and I'm having work done on it." The officer took a look at the land and the markers that clearly indicated private property lines. He glanced back at his partner and shrugged. "Yeah, this is private property, all right. There's no violation here." I expected that to be the end of it, but Karen wasn't about to go down without a fight. As if on cue, she appeared from around the corner, marching up to the officers like she was about to issue them orders. "You need to make him remove those barricades immediately," she demanded. "This road is essential for the community." The officer turned to her, clearly unimpressed. "Ma'am, this isn't a public road. It's his private property. He's allowed to block access while doing construction." Karen's face contorted into a mix of disbelief and fury. "That's not fair," she shrieked. "He can't just shut down a major thoroughfare like this." The officer sighed. "Ma'am, this isn't a thoroughfare. It's his driveway." That should have been the end of it, but Karen wasn't done. "Well, if the police won't do anything about this, they'll will," she snapped. "We have rules in this community, and we won't let some outsider disrupt our way of life." I laughed, shaking my head. "Good luck with that, Karen." As the officers wrapped up, one of them muttered to me, You'd be surprised how often we deal with calls like this. They left without incident, but I had a feeling Karen wasn't finished. Sure enough, the very next morning, I received a letter taped to my front door, an official notice from the HOA. The fine print was pure comedy. Violation: unapproved obstruction of community access road. Penalty: $1,000 fine. I couldn't help but laugh out loud. Not only had Karen failed to get the police to take her side, but now she was trying to enforce an HOA fine on a property that wasn't even under their jurisdiction. But I knew this was more than just a fine. It was a challenge. Karen was testing me, seeing if she could bully me into compliance through sheer persistence. And if there was one thing I wasn't about to do, it was back down to an entitled HOA dictator. What I didn't realize was that Karen was about to take things even further. The fine was just the beginning. Her next move would be even more outrageous, and it would drag the entire neighborhood into a battle they never saw coming. After receiving the laughable HOA fine for shutting down my own driveway, I figured I had two choices: ignore it entirely or respond with a strongly worded letter explaining, in no uncertain terms, that the HOA had no authority over my property. I opted for the latter, drafting a formal reply that outlined the legal boundaries, my property rights, and the fact that my driveway was not a public access road, no matter how much Karen wished it were. I also included a copy of my land deed and a statement from the police officer who had confirmed that I was well within my rights. I sent the letter to the HOA office and expected that would put an end to this nonsense. But if there's one thing I've learned about Karen, it's that she doesn't take no for an answer, especially not when it comes from someone she sees as beneath her. 2 days later, I stepped outside to check on the driveway repairs when I noticed something unusual: bright red and yellow caution tape wrapped around the barricades. My first thought was that the workers had placed it there for safety reasons, but as I walked closer, I saw something even more ridiculous. A massive HOA violation notice had been nailed to a wooden post next to my driveway. Notice of Community Enforcement. This property has been found in violation of HOA infrastructure regulations. This access road will be reopened immediately by order of Green Pines HOA. I actually laughed out loud. Community enforcement? On my private property? Karen must have been losing her mind. I grabbed my phone and took pictures of the absurdity before pulling down the notice and ripping off the caution tape. This was beyond ridiculous, and I was done playing along with her delusions. But then, as if on cue, Karen appeared. She marched up the street like a woman on a mission, clipboard in hand, a smug expression plastered across her face. Behind her, 3 other HOA board members followed, all looking far less confident than she did. She stopped at the entrance to my property, crossing her arms like she was about to make a grand declaration. "I hope you're not thinking about removing that notice," she said, nodding toward the ripped-down paper in my hands. I smirked. "Oh, you mean this nonsense?" I waved it around before crumpling it into a ball and tossing it onto the ground at her feet. Yeah, I was definitely thinking about removing it. Karen's face twisted into a look of pure outrage. "That is an official HOA order. You are in direct violation of community standards, and I demand that you comply immediately." I stared at her for a second, trying to decide if she was actually serious. Then I shook my head. "Karen, this is my property. My driveway. My land. The HOA has zero jurisdiction here. You have no legal right to issue community orders about something you don't own." She huffed, flipping through her clipboard dramatically. "Actually, according to HOA zoning regulations, any roads or driveways that intersect with Green Pines must be kept accessible to all residents." I sighed, rubbing my temples. That would be true if this were a public road. But it's not. It's private property. There is no public access here. You and the HOA are making things up at this point. Karen wasn't listening. You are obstructing community flow, and that is a serious violation. The HOA has the right to restore order when a resident refuses to cooperate. I laughed. Restore order? Karen, this isn't some dystopian dictatorship where you get to rewrite the rules as you go. This is my land. You don't control it. That's when Karen's expression darkened. "Fine," she snapped. "If you refuse to comply, we will have no choice but to take this to the next level." I crossed my arms. Oh, yeah? And what exactly does that mean? Karen turned on her heel, glaring at her three board members. Start the enforcement process, she ordered. To my absolute disbelief, one of the HOA board members, a middle-aged man who looked like he really didn't want to be there, stepped forward and pulled out a bolt cutter. What the hell do you think you're doing? I demanded. Karen smirked. If you won't remove those barricades, we will. I immediately pulled out my phone and started recording. If you touch my property, I will have you arrested for trespassing and destruction of private property. The board member hesitated, looking back at Karen. She, however, was fully committed to her insanity. Go ahead, call the police, she sneered. They'll side with you. I shook my head, dialing 911. Let's find out. As I was explaining the situation to the dispatcher, Karen continued barking orders at the reluctant board members. Cut the chain. Move the barricades, she demanded. But the second the dispatcher heard that HOA members were attempting to forcibly alter private property, she assured me officers were on their way. Minutes later, 2 police cars pulled up to my driveway. The same officer from before stepped out, looking beyond frustrated. Are you serious? He muttered, clearly recognizing Karen. Karen immediately switched tactics. Officer, thank goodness you're here. This man is blocking a community access road, and we are simply enforcing neighborhood regulations. The officer turned to me. You called. Yep, I said, showing him my phone recording. I caught them attempting to cut my property locks and illegally move barricades onto my land. The officer sighed, rubbing his forehead. Ma'am, he said, turning to Karen, we've been over this. This driveway is not part of the HOA's jurisdiction. It is private property. Karen's face contorted. But the community needs this road open. The officer didn't budge. No, they don't. If you or anyone from the HOA attempts to tamper with this property again, you'll be arrested for trespassing and vandalism. Karen's jaw dropped. You can't be serious. The officer wasn't in the mood for her antics. If I have to come back here because of another false report, you will be facing criminal charges. Is that clear? Karen stammered, realizing she had lost. Fine, she mumbled, her face red with fury. She turned to the board members. Let's go. As she stomped off, the officer gave me a sympathetic nod. Sorry you have to deal with this, he muttered before heading back to his patrol car. As the chair retreated, Karen shot me one last glare. This isn't over, she hissed. I grinned. Yeah, Karen. It is. What I didn't realize was that Karen had one last trick up her sleeve, a move so desperate and outrageous that it would finally bring her entire reign crashing down. After the police shut down Karen's absurd attempt to remove my barricades and take control of my driveway, I thought that would be the end of it. Most people, after being threatened with criminal charges, would have backed off, admitted defeat, and slithered away to save face. But not Karen. Not the HOA queen of Green Pines. She was far from done. A few days after the standoff with the police, I noticed something unusual. My mail delivery suddenly stopped. Packages that were supposed to arrive were marked as undeliverable, and my regular mail was being returned to sender. Confused, I called my local post office to ask what was going on, and their response left me completely stunned. Sir, the postal worker said, your address has been reported as vacant and flagged for mail suspension by the Green Pines zone. I nearly dropped the phone. Karen had actually reported my property as abandoned, meaning no mail or deliveries would be sent to my address until I proved otherwise. She literally tried to make it seem like I didn't live there. I wasted no time driving down to the post office with my property deed, ID, and security footage proving I was very much still living in my house. The postmaster apologized for the inconvenience, instantly reinstated my mail, and flagged the HOA's request as fraudulent. But that wasn't enough. I needed to put a stop to this once and for all. So I decided to take the fight directly to Karen. That night, I printed out every piece of evidence I had. The FACO fine for shutting down my driveway. The trespassing incident where Karen tried to remove my barricades. The mail fraud request to mark my house as abandoned. The cease and desist letter I had already sent her. And most importantly, a formal lawsuit draft for harassment, property tampering, and fraudulent claims. Then I marched straight to the next HOA meeting. The moment I walked into the community center, the room fell silent. Even the usual HOA board members, who typically rallied around Karen, looked nervous. I could see Karen's smug expression falter when she saw me carrying a thick folder full of documents. I walked straight up to the front of the room and dropped the entire stack of evidence onto the table in front of her. "We need to talk," I said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. Karen stiffened. "This isn't a discussion forum," she sneered. "We have important community business to address." "Oh, we're going to address some business, all right?" I interrupted. "Specifically, the fact that you have committed mail fraud, attempted property tampering, and illegally tried to enforce HOA rules on private land." The room gasped. Karen's face drained of color as I laid out every piece of evidence, explaining in excruciating detail how she had overstepped her authority, broken the law, and left the HOA exposed to legal liability. The HOA board members looked horrified. It was clear they hadn't been fully aware of just how deep Karen had dug herself into trouble. "You filed a false report with the post office saying my house was vacant," I continued, holding up the reinstatement letter from the postmaster. "That's a federal offense." Karen stammered, but I wasn't done. "You also tried to physically remove my property barricades, which is criminal trespassing." I pointed to the police report. "And let's not forget, you tried to fine me for shutting down my own driveway, despite the HOA having zero authority over my land." By this point, the other board members looked like they were ready to eject Karen out of the HOA on the spot. "I have already spoken with my lawyer," I continued. "If you or anyone from this HOA attempts to interfere with my property again, I will sue you personally for harassment and damages." Karen's confidence crumbled completely. "This is outrageous," she shrieked. "He's lying. This is all an attack on the HOA." That's when the HOA's vice president, Greg, finally spoke up. "Karen," he said, rubbing his forehead, "is any of this true?" Karen's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The silence was deafening. Finally, Greg sighed and turned back to me. "We will officially drop the fine, remove all notices, and formally apologize for this overreach." I crossed my arms. "And Karen?" Greg hesitated. Then, after an excruciating pause, he looked around the room and said, "A motion to remove Karen as HOA president." The room exploded into cheers. People who had once blindly supported Karen were now furious over her abuse of power. Residents who had been fined, harassed, and threatened over the years suddenly had the courage to speak up. One by one, people exposed how Karen had bullied them, fined them over ridiculous infractions, and used the HOA as her personal kingdom. The board immediately voted to strip Karen of her presidency, and before the night was over, she had been kicked out of the HOA entirely. Karen, red-faced and humiliated, stormed out of the meeting, slamming the door behind her. The next day, a for sale sign appeared in front of her house. She was gone within the month. The aftermath, a new HOA and a quiet victory. With Karen finally out of power, the neighborhood began to heal. The new HOA leadership promised real change, ending the aggressive overreach and focusing on making the community better without Karen's tyranny. As for me, I never paid that HOA fine. I kept my driveway exactly as I wanted it, and I lived happily, knowing that Karen would never mess with my land again. Moral of the story: know your property rights, and never, ever let an HOA Karen think they run your life.